Hello, my name is Mon, and this is my data analysis project on the Social Security Administration's popular names list from the years 1880 to 2022. The first half of this video is going to be more quantitative with graphs of like trends and numbers and stuff, whereas the second half is probably just going to be me geeking out about some cool names that I found and looking at the associations between pop culture and names. Anyway, let's get started. I found these text files just by digging around a bit on the internet, and the text files contain every name for male and female babies with 5 or more occurrences for every year back to 1880. And so these are from the Social Security Administration. And if you're not familiar with them, it's in the United States. It's like when you're born, you have a birth certificate and you get a Social Security number, and Social Security Administration records all the popular names of babies. So this is their data. I'm just using it and presenting it. Then they have their own notes about the data, and I'm gonna click through that. And so first of all, this is only based on first names. It's not including anything like middle names like that. I'm just gonna read the important notes that they have. Name data is restricted to births in the 50 United States and District of Columbia. They have data for the U.S. territories, and you can find it on their website, but it is not included in the data set that I have. The names only include the letters, and so hyphens and spaces are removed. So in their example, like Julianne with a hyphen, Julianne is 2 words, and Julianne is 1 word, are counted as a single entry. Different spellings of names are included differently, so all the different Caitlins are counted as all the different Caitlins and not as one Caitlin. And the number of occurrences only goes down to 5. I can't see anything that has less than that, and that's just for like privacy reasons. If someone has if they're like the only person with that name. And the final note I have is that it's hard to find the exact number of babies born in the early years of the data, so I just calculated it from the percentage that the number one name made up, taken from the SSA website. However, the numbers from recent years do tell me that my calculated numbers are a few thousand off in most years, so any number of babies born in a year statistic is probably an overestimate if anything. However, I will say that if you're just looking at it as like 4.3 million, that part is accurate. Final note I have before we start is that if I give a year range for when a name occurred, it is simply the first year and the last year it popped up across both genders, so even if it occurred for girls earlier and for boys more recently, then it's just going to be that first year for the girls and that last year for the boys. I also usually give a number of years alongside that range, and so that's the number of times it popped up for both male and female combined over 143 years. So if a name appeared in every year for both genders, it could be as high as 286, even though there's only 143 actual years of data. So this is my Excel sheet that I made. I'm very proud of this because it took me 7 hours to input like all of this data, and also I sometimes can't. It takes like 20 minutes to open it and it keeps crashing, so I just want to show it off for a second. So this is just the main one with each year in 2 columns with female and male. I also have it sorted alphabetically and girls' names and boys' names. I actually had to write my own methods and formulas to get it to do what I want. So if I type in the name Mullen here, it takes a second to load, but if I type in my own name, I can see the exact number of girls and boys that have been given that name, exactly when it first and last showed up, and the total number of years it showed up. And then I have it connected to this little graph so I can see the exact percentages of it. Although it's actually kind of a bad example because with my name, the masculine name Malin is completely different from the Swedish feminine name Malin. I do have a couple graphs that I use just with this to be fast and simple. The blue line is always female and the orange line is always male. Alright, now let's finally get started by talking about some various statistics that I came across. There are 9 different generations covered in this data, starting with the last 3 years of the missionary generation, which was babies born from 1860 to 1882. There are approximately 220,000 babies born in the last 3 years of this generation, and on average, 93.2% of them were given a name with 5 or more occurrences. The most common names were Mary and John, followed by Anna and William. Then came the lost generation, which was from 1883 to 1900. Approximately 5.9 million babies were born, with an average of 1.3 million per year. And on average, 93.7% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences. And the most common names were Mary and John, followed by Anna and William in second. So this generation, compared to the last one, has slightly less original names, because a higher percentage of them share their names with other people. Then came the greatest generation, who were born from 1901 to 1927. And a couple of these people are still alive, and they're like the oldest citizens of the United States. There are approximately 38.7 million babies born, with an average of 1.4 million per year. On average, 93.7% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common names were Mary and John, followed by Helen and Robert. This is where the names kind of started to switch around a little bit more. And after that was the silent generation, born from 1928 to 1945. Approximately 42.5 million babies were born, with an average of 2.3 million per year. On average, 97.12% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common names were Mary, Robert, Barbara, James, and Betty. Immediately following World War II came the baby boom generation, from 1946 to 1964, when a whopping 74.9 million babies were born, with an average of 3.9 million per year. And that might not seem like that much compared to today, but if you compare it to the 2 generations surrounding it, it's really high. And on top of that, 97.9% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences. They shared a lot of names with each other. There wasn't a whole lot of, for lack of a better term, creativity. And the most common names were Mary, James, Linda, Robert, Lisa, and Michael. And then after that came Generation X, born from 1965 to 1980. Approximately 55.1 million babies were born, or an average of 3.4 million per year. On average, 95.77% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common names were Michael, Jennifer, Christopher, David, Melissa, and Jason. And then came the millennials, from 1981 to 1996. Approximately 62.4 million babies were born, with an average of 3.9 million per year, and on average, 94.04% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common baby names were Michael, Ashley, Christopher, Jessica, and Jennifer. Then came Generation Z, and this is where I fall in. There are approximately 57.5 million babies born, with an average of 4.1 million per year. On average, 92.44% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common names were Emily, Jacob, Michael, Isabella, and Madison. And finally, the most recent generation is Generation Alpha, born from 2011 to 2024. And I'm filming this in 2024, so Generation Alpha is still being born, and because the 2023 data has not been released from Social Security Administration, the last 2 years are excluded from everything in this presentation. Approximately 46.2 million babies were born, with an average of 3.8 million per year. And on average, 92.35% of babies were given a name with 5 or more occurrences, and the most common names were Liam, Olivia, Noah, Emma, and Sophia. So now I have a couple of the mosts here. So the most girls receiving a single name was 99,693 Lindas, born in 1947. And the most boys receiving a single name was 94,758 James, born in 1947 as well. The most babies born in a single year was 2007, with approximately 4.3 million babies. But relative to population size, it's 1957, with also approximately 4.3 million, but still slightly less than 2007. The highest number of names with 5 or more occurrences was 20,576 girls' names in 2007, and the highest number of boys' names with 5 or more occurrences was 14,619 in 2008, and the highest number of names with exactly 5 occurrences was 5,050 also in 2008. So right around the late 2000s, people were being like really creative in naming their kids. And I'm probably gonna use the word creative when I talk about this, and I really just mean they're being more original in naming their kids, and there's more names from like wider sources. That's what I mean by that. Couple of statistics. So on average, 95% of babies born have a name with 5 or more occurrences, and I always just found that statistic by taking the sum of the babies given a name with 5 or more occurrences divided by the total number of babies born in that year. The year with the highest percentage is 1954, when it reached 98.05%, and the year with the lowest percentage is 2010, with 92.03%. And this is also following that trend with 2007 and 2008, where the late 2000s, early 2010s had a lot of originality. Is that a word? Had a lot of originality in naming their kids. So there's a really large pool of names overall. There are 2,085,158 separate entries across male and female names over 143 years. So that's how many cells in my Excel sheet are filled with names, but if you double that, I have like 4.6 million cells filled in my Excel sheet, which explains why it keeps crashing every time I try to delete a graph. There have been approximately 383.9 million babies born between 1880 and 2022. There were a total of 1,221,918 entries for girls' names and 850,363 entries for boys' names. And as the notes from the Social Security website said, placeholder names are included in this data, so here's all the ones that I could think of and the numbers and years in which they showed up. There are only 2 instances of infant female and infant male, with 5 girls in 2005 and 5 boys in 2003. Baby girl had 1,925 girls named recorded as that from 1979 to 2022, and also 6 boys in 1990. There were 2,164 boys from 1983 to 2022 named baby boy. From 1886 to 2022, there were 9,683 girls named unknown, and from 1880 to 2022, there were 9,689 boys named unknown. I guess I shouldn't be saying they were named unknown, they were recorded as unknown. but they were probably named something else later, so we don't really know what their name is. This is just how they were recorded by Social Security. From 1912 to 2022, there were 6,012 girls named Baby, and in that same time frame, there were 6,247 boys given the name Baby. From 1983 to 2021, there were 3,832 girls and 4,163 boys recorded as infant. Now, the first name I wanted to look at really closely is the name Madison, which rose in popularity after the 1984 movie Splash and becoming number 2 in the United States for girls. However, it was a popular boys' name in the early 1900s before disappearing from the top 1,000. And looking at Social Security's top 5 names by state for 2002 shows that nearly every state has Madison on the list, except for Wisconsin, likely because it's the state capital, and a few coastal states. So, I made a map to show the rank of the name Madison in 2002. And here's that map. So the darker the state is, the more popular it was. So 1 indicates that it was the most popular name, and 2 indicates that it was the second most popular, etc. So first of all, Madison is famously the last name of President James Madison, was the 4th president of the United States, and I haven't seen the movie Splash, but from what I read on the internet, it seems that the character gets their name from a street sign in like New York City or something, and presumably that street is named after James Madison. However, it's also the name of the state capital of Wisconsin, which is why I think that it is lower for that state. As you can see, it's popular in a lot of other places, being not in necessarily number 1 for most of the Midwest, and California is a lot lower. And maybe that's because California has a lot of cultures in it going on. I know I always associate California with like historically people like moving there for like their chance or whatever, and also kind of New York, which is also much lower than the surrounding states, although most of the East Coast is lower overall. That's really the only point I want to make about this. I just think it's interesting that Wisconsin is so much lower for the name Madison, given that it's our state capital, that there's got to be a correlation there. All right, now we're going to get into the trends of names. So this first graph, and it's really messy, kind of just ignore that for a second, is the percentage of girls with the top 2 names each year. So it starts very high with Mary at over 7% of girls and Anna in second at about 2.7% of girls. And for decades, there's a big difference between the number 1 and number 2 name because it's just Mary. It's overwhelmingly Mary. And then Linda takes over. And after that, they kind of become closer together, with the number 1 name being pretty consistent for a while, and the number 2 names are switching out. But then we reach the late 80s and early 90s when Ashley and Jessica are fighting for the number 1 spot, and it gets really close for a while. And it has generally stayed really close. Although for the last couple of years, Emma has had just a little bit of a lead over Emma. And I have the same graph for the percentage of boys with the top 2 names. And unlike the girls, it starts out very close, with John on top and William in second, and while there is a little bit of a difference later on, it does stay pretty close together compared to the girls. Then it switches, stays close together, and then we reach the 60s when Michael becomes the number 1 name for a couple of decades. And as you can see, the number 2 name is kind of switching back and forth. Then comes Jacob, then it becomes Noah, and it's been Liam for the last couple of years, and the number 1 and number 2 name have been very close together overall. So keeping these 2 graphs in mind, I have the third graph is the differences between the percentages of the top 2 names. So the pink line shows the girls and the blue line shows the boys. And as you can see, the boy's name is overall closer to the bottom until the 60s when Michael becomes the number 1 name, and it becomes so popular, there's a much more of a difference between number 1 and number 2 before it kind of goes back down to being really close to 0 as the difference. And the girls start out with a high difference, and it just has slowly declined. In the 70s, it got really kind of higher again, and then it's just leveled out to being almost 0 again in the recent years. This graph shows the difference between the number of male and female names with 5 or more occurrences. So for this one, I just counted the total number of names in each column, in the male column and in the female column for each year, and I subtracted the male from the female because generally, with the exception of the first 3 years down here, there has always been vastly more female names, and you can see that easily in this trend when the difference peaks around like over 6,000 more girls' names and around, oh, the x-axis isn't labeled on here. Oops. I think that's around 2010 though. It's kind of going down kind of quickly after having a pretty steady rise. I mean, it started off a little slow, went down a little bit for some reason, but then it's been going up pretty steadily. And as for this decline, this sharp decline in recent years, it's not necessarily that there's more boys' names, it's actually that there's fewer girls' names, which is on this next graph, which is just the number of girls and boys' names by year. Pink is girls, blue is boys. Around 2010, when they both peak, the boys really kind of leveled out, but the girls has been going down more. And I don't know what happened in the 1910s here to cause this kind of hump here. Has been kind of like a slow, steady rise upwards, peaking in 2010 and kind of leveling out. And earlier, they start very close together with more boys, and then obviously they separate, come back together a little bit, and then just separate even more each year. This next section is just some observations I've had. And just some things I've observed from importing all these names into Excel. A popular name these days means something different than it did in 1950s, because in 2024 there's a much bigger pool of names to choose from than in the 1950s, and the difference is in the thousands. And since popular names differ by state and city, and different cities have different cultural makeups, different names will be popular in different places. But with a largely white population overall, we still have a lot of English names that are overwhelmingly number one in the United States. Think back to the Madison graph I just showed you. And this is something that I saw when I did a project just looking at my high school. I got all of the yearbooks my high school has ever produced, and I recorded the name of every senior for every year just to analyze the name trends. One thing I saw was the number of names was increasing by year. And just as a small example, in my high school graduating class of about 250 students, we had 6 Jacks, 6 Nicholases, 5 Annas, and 5 Sophias. But none of these names are in the top 10. One of them isn't even in the top 20, and one of them doesn't even reach top 30. Meanwhile, the number 1 names in the United States for the year I was born, Jacob and Emily, had 1 and 0 occurrences respectively, and I never even met an Emily until college. But if we look at my high school's graduating class of 1975, so the same exact area, but it was a larger population at the time, so there was 360 students, there were 23 boys named John, which was the most of any one name in my high school's history, which is why I'm choosing this year. And in 1957, when most of these 23 Johns would have been born, it was only the number 5 name. And I believe the second name for that year was like David, which had maybe 18 Davids. So there's quite a few more Johns. There's not even like ties in the 1975 because the names are just overwhelmingly more popular. And these 6 Jacks would made up about 2.5% of my class, and these 23 Johns were 6%. If you add up the 6 Jacks and the 6 Nicholases in my graduating class, that's still less percentage-wise than the 23 Johns made up in 1975. And like I said, this is a small example, but my point is that giving your kid the number 1 name no longer means that they will have to be like Olivia H. or Noah L. They may be the only one. A larger population and more cultural diversity as a whole has changed what a popular name means because we have so many more names these days. And yes, it does depend also like where you live. If you're sending your kid to a huge school, there's probably more of a chance that there will be more kids with their name, but they might not interact with them as much. But if they're in elementary school when their class has like 20 kids in it, they probably will be the only one. But it does depend on where you live. The next observation I had was around double A names. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, but there's been increase in names beginning with 2 A's other than Aaron. And while some of these names are related to non-English cultures, a lot of them being Arabic, such as Amir, Aliyah, Ali. A lot of them seem to be part of the unique trend of misspelling names on purpose, like Amber, Erica, Adam. And there do seem to be more female names following this pattern than male, and a few of these alternate spellings must surely be influenced by the name Aaron with 2 A's. And I don't really have a graph to back this up necessarily, but this does seem to be a more modern trend. As for the first few decades, the only names with 2 A's were Aaron in both male and female. Aaron first showed up in female in 1914, and the first double A name that was not Arabic, Hindu, Dutch, Danish, or some other culture, or some variant of Aaron, was double A Erica with a K and double A Erica with a C, both of which suddenly popped up in 1979. And there's only been more of these double A names since then. And continuing off of what I was just speaking about with more cultural diversity in the United States, that got me curious about what did the United States look like in 1880 in terms of culture and race. And so I Googled the 1880 census and the 2020 census to get that data and just calculate the percentages. Additionally, the 2020 census compared to the 2010 census and censuses before that expanded the questions of race and ethnicity to include more categories and more accurate labels, whereas 1880 used like 5 racistly labeled categories. And so here I have those percentages, but first of all, just for reference, this is the United States in 1880. The red and blue ones are the states, and the gray ones are just the territories, and there was no Alaska or Hawaii. And so the total population in 1880 was 50,155,783, with the white population being 86.5% of that, the black population being 7.99% of that, the Chinese population being 0.21% of that, and the Japanese population being 148 people. The Native American population was 0.132%. So I just Googled it because I was wondering why the Native American population was like a really small percentage compared to the percentage that it is like more recently. And so I Googled when the Trail of Tears was, and it was like half a century before 1880, but it did force them to go to Oklahoma and presumably some other states, but Oklahoma isn't a territory at this time, so maybe that's why it's so small. And maybe territories weren't counted. I don't know. I'm not a census expert. I just went down a rabbit hole for like 10 minutes. But if we compare this to today, we have 50 states, a population of 331,449,281. The white non-Hispanic population makes up 58.9%, and the Black or African American population is 13.6%. The American Indian and Alaska Native population is 1.3%. The Asian population is 6.3%. The Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population is 0.3%. Two or more races is 3%. Hispanic or Latino population is 19.1%. And the white alone population is 75.5%. The next section I have is just about the names John and Mary specifically. When I think of like the default names for like every decade up till like maybe the 70s, I think of John and Mary. So that's why I have this section. There were 5,158,428 male Johns born between 1880 and 2022, and 4,134,713 female Marys born between 1880 and 2022. And so with those numbers in mind, with there being about a million more Johns and Marys, here is a graph of the number of Johns and Marys born by year. So the first peak comes in the 1910s, and the second peak comes in the 1940s. And one thing that is interesting to note real quick is that both of them peak right around the end of one of the world wars, with this one being around the end of World War I, and this being around the end of World War II. And while there are, at the start, more Marys, around the end of World War II, Marys doesn't have nearly as many Johns. And additionally, John tapers off slower and later than Mary, which tapers off faster and earlier, and that's why there's a million more Johns. Here are some fun facts about Mary. So 1947 was the first year Mary was not the number one girl's name, when it was dethroned by Linda. And 1961 was the year Mary dropped out of the number one spot forever, when it was dethroned by Lisa. And 1972 was the year Mary dropped out of the top 10s forever. In 1880, 7.238% of girls were given the name Mary, which was the highest percentage of any girl's name. 15,173 boys have been given the name Mary, and in 2022, 2,097 girls and roughly 0 boys were named Mary. And again, it's roughly 0 because it was just less than 5, so it didn't show up at all. And here's some facts about John. So 1924 was the first year John was not the number one boy's name when it was dethroned by Robert, and that was the same year it dropped out of the number one forever. So like I said, it stopped being number one earlier, but it had a much slower, steadier decline than Mary, which lasted longer but fell off quicker. In 1880, 8.155% of boys were given the name John, which was the highest percentage of any boy's name, and 21,655 girls have been given the name John. In 2022, 7 girls and 7,930 boys were named John. And I'm going to show you a closer look at state names. And I'm considering a state name to be a name that is the exact same spelling as the full state name, with the exception of 2-word names. So instead of North and South Dakota, we're just looking at Dakota. Instead of North and South Carolina, we're just looking at Carolina. We're going to ignore West Virginia, we're just going to look at Virginia. All of the new states just dropped the new. Also, I forgot to write it down, but District of Columbia, we're just looking at Columbia and we're not looking at district. And remember, the list only goes down to 5 occurrences. So 0 could be as high as 568, and I wouldn't know it, but I think a name occurring exactly 4 times for 143 straight years is pretty unlikely. So I'm not going to read all this out. If you want to pause it, try to find your state, you can, but I'm going to read out the interesting ones. Arizona, for in only 126 years across both genders, but does cover the entire span, with 3,217 girls and 144 boys. Georgia is a pretty popular common name, and that's because unlike most of these other ones, it's not that you're naming your kid after the state. You're just naming your kid a name, and that name happens to be the same as the state. In fact, Georgia, the state, was named after King George, but because Europeans generally tend to see land and countries as being feminine, they didn't name it George, they named it Georgia because that's the feminized version of George. This name covers the entire span popping up in 210 years with 158,996 girls and 728 boys receiving the name Georgia. Hawaii and Illinois have both only popped up in 3 years, with Hawaii being a little more recent with 16 total, and Illinois being way back in from 1918 to 1923 with 11 girls and 5 boys. Indiana was one that I didn't really expect to be so popular. It covers the entire span, popping up in 119 years with 1,824 girls and 1,240 boys, which is pretty similar with more girls being named Indiana. There was only 1 year where kids were named Kentucky, and it was 5 boys in 2018. There could be others, but it just was never more than 5 in any other year. And it's the same with Maine and Michigan. In 1898, there were 9 girls named Maine, and in 2006, there were 5 boys named Michigan. Montana is another fairly popular one. Well, it first popped up in 1910. It's been much more common in recent years, and there's been a total of 8,157 girls and 3,707 boys given the name Montana. And the state name Montana comes from the Spanish word montaña, roughly meaning mountainous. Yeah, unlike Georgia, which is one of the other fairly popular state names, this one isn't like the feminized version of a name. This is just from the Spanish word for mountain. And much like Georgia, Carolina has a similar story, where the state Carolina was named after King Charles, and the state was named Carolina, with Carolina being thought of as the feminine form of Charles. I'm not really sure how they got that, but that is where it comes from. So this is another case of not necessarily naming your kid after a state, but naming your kid a name that happens to be a state. And Carolina popped up from the whole span over 163 years with 45,731 girls and 137 boys named Carolina. Dakota is a similar case to Montana, where it's been a lot more popular in recent years, but it did first pop up in 1915. There have been 38,042 girls and 89,907 boys named Dakota. And again, like Montana, it's not a name that happens to be the same name as a state. Dakota is the Sioux word for friend, and the Sioux are the indigenous people living in the Dakotas. There was 1 year with a couple little Oklahomas born, and that was 1907 when 5 girls were named Oklahoma. And in 1989, there were 5 girls named Road, and that was the only year for that one. Utah was one that was much more popular than I expected. From 1918 to 2022, in 44 years, there were 374 boys named Utah. And the other really big state is Virginia, but this one is not exactly coming from the name of royalty. For this state, Virginia, is named Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. I don't know why they call her that, honestly, but that's where Virginia comes from, and you can see that the virgin part is in there. But it covers the whole span from 1880 to 2022 with 651,230 girls and 2,009 boys named Virginia. And here we have the states that did not appear, which were Arkansas, Connecticut, Delaware, Idaho, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Mississippi, Hampshire, Mexico, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And one thing to note about these is that most of them are like the long, hard to spell names like Pennsylvania and Connecticut and Massachusetts, and also some other ones that I don't know. I don't know why no one named their kid Idaho. I was a little surprised no one named their kid Idaho. And if you want to visualize all of that graphically, I did that here. So I colored the states differently based on how many total across both genders there were. So the red states are the ones that had a negligible number, meaning that they're all of these states. The blue ones had fewer than 100 total babies at any point. The purple ones had between 100 and 1,000. The yellow had between 1,000 and 10,000, and the green ones had more than 10,000, which are just those 5 states that I talked about already. And one thing you can notice is that the Northeast is not very popular for naming your kid after, and the Midwest is kind of second, but I mean, Montana, I think, and the Dakotas are technically included in the Midwest, but that's like an outlier. It drags up the average. Oh, so I have DC grayed out, but I actually already presented the data for Columbia. I only added that after I got my Excel sheet back open after I crashed it. And I just mentioned the thing about the regions. And so what I did was I added the sum of the states based on the regions from this National Geographic map. And I added them up and I divided them by the total number of states in that region. I did not include District of Columbia in the Southeast, but the West had an average of 1,484 per state. The Southwest had 1,006. The Midwest had 12,169. The Southeast had 71,928, and the Northeast had 565. So that one's the least popular, but the West does kind of get dragged up by Montana, and the Midwest gets dragged up by North Dakota, but the Southeast does have Carolina and Georgia and Virginia all in a row over here. And those are also some of the oldest states, which I guess does make sense that, they've been around a while, so people have been naming their kids after them for a while. I also have some other name things that we can look at, and I'm not going to read all of these out either, but with colors, I took red, orange, no yellows, green, blue, indigo. There were no purples, pink, gray spelled the British way, and Grayson. There's not much to say about these other than that, with the exception of pink, green, and orange. Most of them are still popping up, with a few being born in 2022. Gray, and Grayson have grown vastly popular in the last couple of years, especially Grayson. There's been 110,344 boys and 440 girls named Grayson between 1905 and 2022. And Gray are pretty similar, with a couple hundred girls, but a couple thousand boys getting those names. And with flowers and tree, there was just so many that I just screenshotted my Excel sheet here. But one thing that does pop out to me is that there's a lot of zeros on the boys' side, and those are the flower names. And there's only 2 zeros on the girls' side, and those are both tree names, birch and spruce. And if you look at the biggest numbers, they're all flowers. So flowers seem to be more common as feminine names, and trees seem more common as masculine names. However, there is a lot of overlap, especially with the more common flower names like lily. Well, actually, not lily. Jasmine, ivy, iris, holly. Although, actually, Holly was like insanely popular in the 80s. I also looked at Disney princesses, and specifically the ones that are considered like the Disney princesses. So there are no Snow Whites, but Cinderella, Aurora, Ariel, Belle, Pocahontas, Mulan, Tiana, Rapunzel, Merida, and Rhea. And all of these, with the exception of Rapunzel, which only popped up in 1959 and 2017 in those 2 years, all of them have had data as recently as 2022. And there is a couple other things to note though. Cinderella is a very old fairy tale. I'm not sure about Sleeping Beauty, but Aurora is a Latin name meaning new dawn. So not necessarily popular, but it's always been there. And the movie, looking at a graph of these numbers, didn't seem to have much of an impact on it. Ariel, however, did. It had a massive impact. And it's the same with Belle. I don't actually recall whether the movie had that much of an impact on it, but it's a French name meaning beauty or beautiful. Mulan, however, is based on a true story, or I guess based on like a historical legend. But the first year it popped up was 1998, which was the same year that the movie Mulan was released. And with Tiana, well, it's been a name since the 50s. When the movie came out, the only occurrences for boys, just 5 or just 9, was immediately following that movie's release. And then with Merida, it spans from 1916 to 2022. However, in 1880, there were 5 male Meridas born. I'm not sure why, because there's been no other male Meridas even after the movie Brave was released. And I also looked at zodiac signs. Now, I'm not familiar with zodiac signs or like how they work or what they mean. So if you know that, interpret this at your own will. But these ones in black are the only ones that had any babies named that at all. And I'm assuming that they were probably named that because of when they were born. Aries does seem to be the most popular, with 2,099 girls and 3,623 boys named between 1970 and 2022, with data for this name popping up in almost every year. Now, I call Aries the most popular because the thing about Leo is that it's the common nickname for Leonard. And so a lot of these Leos are probably just named Leo by their parents, opposed to just naming them Leonard. It's insanely popular, but it's probably not entirely due to the fact it's a zodiac sign. But most of these have had data for the last couple of years, except for Libra, which never seemed to be that popular, and Scorpio, and Aquarius, which only went to 2020, but still. And the zodiac signs that never showed up were Virgo, Cancer, Capricorn, Sagittarius, and Pisces. I also looked up some fruit names because some names like cherry and clementine and olive have been around for a while, back to 1880, and have quite a few thousand with those names. But then there's names like strawberry or peach or orange, which we already saw in the color part. And then there's berry, spelled like the fruit, but could also just have been used as an alternative to berry with an A. But there's also apple and lemon. Lemon's been around for a while, but names like apple and peach and strawberry are more new. And all of these names, except for cherry, clementine, olive, and berry have just a couple hundred. Well, I guess lemon reaches just over 1,000, but it's just a handful of them in the grand scheme of things. And then with planets, most of which get their names from Roman gods and are actually just very, very old names, we see a similar trend that a lot of them have been more popular, have data from recent years, with the exception of Uranus, which with only 5 girls named Uranus in 1969. I tried to see if there was some big news around Uranus in 1969, but I couldn't find anything. The only thing I can think of is that's the year we landed on the moon, so maybe people were just like really into space that year. The other one with only 1 year was Pluto, when in 2022 the last year of data I have, there were 7 boys. The most popular one does seem to be Venus, popping up in 150 years between 1887 and 2022, with 9,587 girls and 96 boys. It's also worth mentioning that Venus is the Roman goddess of like love and fertility. Final category we're gonna look at is months and days. So I took all 12 months and all 7 days of the week and typed them in my formula to see what came out, and 11 months with no February produced results, and 5 days with no Thursday or Saturday produced results. Now, when you think of a month name, you're probably thinking of April, May, June, or August, and those are definitely the most popular ones. And maybe that's because springtime is associated with like new stuff or birth, because that's when all the plants come back to life after the winter. And August and July were inserted into the calendar by Augustus and Julius Caesar. September, October, November, and December are much lower than the springtime months, but there's still a couple thousand, with November just under that. And January also has about 2,000, but no February, and March only has barely 300. But all of these have data in 2022 except for March, which again barely has 300 and it is one of the older ones. One thing I want to mention though is that the fall months from like August to October are the most common months to be born in, especially September. September is 9 months after Christmas and New Year's, so it's a very common birthday month, but it's not the most common month name. It's barely even more popular than the months surrounding it, especially because August is, from the Roman name Augustus. But if we look at days of the week, we see a similar thing in that pretty much all of them have data for recent years and they're all kind of becoming more popular, except for Monday. But I mean, there's that whole thing about like, oh, everyone hates Mondays. And so there's been only 35 girls named that. And overall, most of these are girls' names. There's only 83 boys that have any of these day of the week names, and that's Sunday, which is arguably the most popular one, beating out Tuesday just by a little bit. Furthermore, when I typed in the name Day, D-A-Y, most of the results were feminine. So I guess people are seeing the day ending as feminine, which definitely attributes to why there's so few boys with any of these names. But while September's the most common month to be born in, the most common day of the week to be born is Thursday, which has no data. And Sunday is actually the least common and is the least common day to be born on, but it's the most popular name. But I do find that to be an interesting trend. And a few more observations about the days of the week is that as I looked at the graph, as I said, they're becoming more common in the last few years. However, Tuesday has only been decreasing. Monday hasn't had data since 2020, and it barely had data at all. January and April both peaked in the 70s, but are making a comeback. June peaked in the 1910s, but is also making a comeback. And the month of March has no data in 2022, along with Monday, which I've apparently forgot to write down. And October had a massive jump from 2006 to 2007, but I can't find any famous people or pop culture reason why. I tried looking it up and I didn't really get any results. So there you have it. That's all like 78 slides of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you learned something cool about names or name trends. If you like this video, I do have several other videos on my channel, most of which are data analysis of crime shows, but all of which are data. So subscribe if you want to see more data videos. And thank you for watching.